Okay, hopefully everybody had some time to grab a coffee or another drink, stretch their legs. Um, we're going to go ahead and get started with our next session, regulatory reform opportunities and challenges. Um, we're going to first hear from Sam Durfee, the planning manager for the City of Nashua. Then we'll hear from Joseph Perez, who is the Planning and Development Director for the Town of Plymouth. And finally, we will hear from Judi Barrett, who is the founder and principal at Barrett Planning Group, who has assisted many communities throughout New Hampshire with amending their zoning ordinances. So it should be another great session. And Sam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Noah. Everyone can hear me, see me? Okay.
Yep, all set.
Thanks very much, Noah. All right. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's a great opportunity to talk about some of the work we've been doing in Nashua. We are very, very close to the adoption of our new land use code, which has been about a 3-year process in the making, and it really has been just a wonderful time. So I'll kind of get right into it. So process really began with the adoption of the master plan in 2021. So with any good planning effort, the master plan is really what sets the vision. And then in my mind, the land use code is what manifests that vision through regulations. So we felt that we came away from the master plan process with very clear direction in terms of what we needed to accomplish through regulatory structure. We have a strong mayor, board of aldermen, representative municipal structure, which having operated in cities most of my professional career, but living in a town with a town meeting structure, I'm very grateful to be working under a city structure. It certainly helps with any legislative efforts that we undertake. So the Board of Aldermen had allocated $225,000 for this project, but very fortuitously, just as we were finalizing our selection for our consultant, Sarah Reitzman from New Hampshire Housing had said, "Hey, haven't you heard about the HOP grant?" And we pushed pause on our work for just a moment so that we could actually apply for the HOP grant. And we were successful both with HOP 1 and HOP 2, which really allowed us to expand the scope of what the work that we were going to undertake. We were able to do some visioning for some specific neighborhoods that did not receive their due attention as part of the master plan process. And then we were also able to roll in our site plan and subdivision regulations as part of the code work. And once the code is adopted, we'll begin focusing our effort onto some pre-approved ADU building plans. Obviously, there was a change in the state law very recently. So with ADUs permitted by right, attached and detached, there's a lot of opportunities for gentle density and kind of a disbursement of housing density increases across the city and not just in key areas that are slated for growth. So when looking at a comprehensive update, and obviously I'm kind of teeing this up for Joseph, who will be following me with a bit more of a piecemeal approach, we took a comprehensive approach where we knew that we had a lot of problems with our existing code, a lot of regulatory band-aids to try and solve problems as they came up, a little bit like whack-a-mole. So we had learned from that. We know where our pain points are, and so we decided we need to do this in a comprehensive manner, which really allowed the opportunity to look at the fundamentals of land use regulation and make very significant changes, which just cannot be done at piecemeal. So it was a very interesting approach and one that allowed a huge level of flexibility and the opportunity to really look at the system as a whole. And so doing this way, it really allows for just consistency across the board. It's not like we change one thing and then we find later that that has impacted something else in the code, and those two sections weren't talking to each other, and we result in problems. So we've been able to avoid that. The entire code is getting updated. And so not only does that allow us to fix some structural issues, but also when we go from current code to new code, it's a seamless shift into a new, everyone's on board, everyone knows that this is coming, and hey, look, all right, we're dropping the old one, new one's in play. Obviously, there's a lot of learning curve that can occur with that. That is, I'd say, one of the drawbacks because it is a total shift. But day one, new code. And with this approach, it's a longer process. So what that allows is for a lot of opportunity for engagement with stakeholders, and that is the public, that is the code users, not only from the staff side and other departments that land use touches, but also our frequent flyers, as we like to say, our civil engineering firms, our architects, our urban designers, everyone that's involved in land development, people who use the code frequently, land use attorneys. They have been a part of this process for quite some time, which has been fantastic. On the drawbacks, it just takes more time. It takes more time. It takes more money. It is a huge effort. So just from a staff capacity standpoint, I have been very focused on this for the past 3 years, and I'm fortunate to have staff to kind of cover the day-to-day operations while we get this code written and adopted. But it's an incredible burden on time, but all for great reasons. And obviously, the learning curve associated with a full shift can be significant. But again, so we drew from the master plan. The master plan laid out some pretty clear direction. We wanted to identify specific areas where we wanted to incentivize redevelopment. We've heard a lot from the community that we want higher quality buildings. We want green design. This got a little stymied by HB 428, which specifically limits municipalities' ability to impose regulations that could be construed as building or fire code changes. So we ended up pivoting that to more sustainable site design standards, with more intense landscaping standards, more intentional design on how stormwater is handled, and providing bonuses, if you will, in terms of how landscaping obligations are met through that program. We also wanted to improve our multimodal transportation opportunities. So we've been very intentional with how we set some standards for new streets, really focusing on design speed rather than saying, okay, just throw a couple of lanes down the road and we'll sign it at 25 and people will just follow the signs, because we all know that doesn't work. People will drive as fast as they feel comfortable. So really designing the street types for desired speeds. And we wanted to improve the process and also improve predictability. So that really relates to aligning the regulations with the existing character. And this has been one of the selling points of what has really turned into a form-based code. We like to say that it helps to quantify the qualitative look and feel of the neighborhood, so that character that is so loved can be replicated, not repeated in the sense that it's just cookie cutter, but there's clearly a character, and if we're able to capture those standards, whatever comes into that neighborhood won't be out of place. A really strong selling point when talking to residents who have a lot of pride in their neighborhood. And we did want to also improve public realm, and again, this ties back to the quality of development. And form standards really do help with that, and how we are very intentional about organizing buildings around green space. That has come into play as well. So continuing on with the master plan a little bit, the master plan identified these key areas for significant redevelopment. We have two major regional commercial corridors, that being Amherst Street up in the northwest quadrant of the city and Daniel Webster Highway down in the southeast. Obviously, retail is going through a moment, as it has been for quite some time now, with the rise of online shopping. And we have seen large box stores turn over, and we wanted to create an opportunity for how those can develop in a meaningful way, kind of reminiscent of traditional neighborhood development, but give very clear standards and help people as they see this change come to us and say, hey, look, we'd love to do something with this 20-acre site. What do we do? So it actually helps set the stage for the development of parallel street networks to these major corridors, which really suffer from traffic concerns. But again, using the master plan as guidance for how we develop the code has been just crucial and really a focal point of the entire effort. So we took these areas and we kind of summed them into these specific locations, but then broaden them out slightly to identify really where the code is primarily going to focus. The rest of these areas in like that lighter teal, very established neighborhoods, very clear design, and we recognize that these areas aren't the areas that are going to benefit from growth. We would also face a lot of opposition if we were to force growth here, so we wanted to stay away from them. Not exactly lock them in amber. Obviously, the ADU bill allows for some growth, but we wanted to make sure that we weren't upsetting expectations in these areas and really focusing on the areas that the master plan directed us to. Master plan also told us to utilize some scenario planning. So we leaned on our friends over at Plan New Hampshire, and we did a charrette for the mill yard. This was a really fantastic endeavor. So this was back in May of last year. If you've ever done a charrette, they're fantastic. 2-3 days of just really intense focused design. You've got to engage the community. They've got to be there as participants. And the timing of this was fantastic because actually we have an RFP out for a couple of properties in the mill yard, and this aligned perfectly with that and helped provide some guidance to that. So we've been able to incorporate some of the charrette outcomes into the code itself. So when we began looking at neighborhood character and these patterns, we did some mapping analyses. This looked at density in some of the Tree Street neighborhoods. My apologies. These areas are very dense, a lot of housing, a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing. But if you look at this map, you'll see anything that has a hash over it is non-conforming from a density standpoint, which basically means you could not build this neighborhood under current code. Obviously, this neighborhood is acceptable from a character standpoint. So why is it the neighborhood that's wrong, or is it the code that's wrong? I think that's a very clear answer to that question. So through these analyses, we identified, what are the major things that we're going to need to change. Here's an example of lot size nonconformity. The red is nonconforming. That district all the way on the right has no lot size minimums, so obviously all of that is conforming. And the pattern replicates with front setback picket dimensional regulation. The majority of the lots in most of these areas are non-conforming. So very clear direction to legalize existing forms and characters and perpetuate that to allow that next level of incremental growth. So this is our current zoning map that we're operating under. You'll notice just large blocks of color. This is really reflective of just trying to capture some character and just bring it all together and organize it in that way. For the outlying areas outside of downtown, that generally works. But we found through our character analysis process that we needed something far more granular. So this is our proposed zoning map. And this gets very into the weeds. We've identified a lot of areas that really do need specific districts tailored to what the character is. So this helps to serve as the basis for going back to our targeted redevelopment areas. We've established a redevelopment overlay. Now, what this effectively means is upzoning in a way. It's entirely optional. This is how we approach inclusionary zoning. If you want better districts, which unlocks higher order building types, basically more density, you are subject to inclusionary zoning and have to provide some level of affordability and also site performance standards. So there's a little give and take here. In the downtown, it's straight up zoning. You get to go up into the next order district based off of what the character is in the area. We determine what that next level of appropriate density and district order is. Out on the corridors, though, this is really interesting because in the downtown, the upzoning is informed by existing patterns. Out on the corridors, there are no patterns. It's all strip retail development. So if it was to go into a more mixed use pattern, there's no existing patterns to really inform that. So we wanted to use a district group, basically allowing you to, if you can control a certain amount of land, basically a 20-acre minimum, you have the opportunity to create your own regulating plan, basically your own site zoning map. Within reason, though, there's parameters. Basically, you can use 10% of the lowest order district up to 10% of the highest order district, but you need to have a mix. It's not just all, you don't need to do, 6-story mid-rise apartments all the way through. We need some dynamics. We need some variability in building heights and characters and form to really create a neighborhood rather than just, boom, new development, 200 units of housing and no character. So there's a whole lot to talk about on that one, but I'll just kind of leave it there. So that's I'm very excited about that part of the code, and we're really hoping that it delivers housing in a meaningful way. But I want to talk a little bit about our form standards. So these are a couple of cut sheets from the code that talks about our specific building types. And these are more missing middle, if you will, in terms of their scale. We have the apartment house, townhouse. Basically, we look at how these control the massing of buildings, so that if you were to build something bigger or smaller than what these massing parameters are, it just wouldn't be these buildings. It's a way of saying that why didn't we have just a really large townhouse? Well, if it was any larger, it'd be something entirely different. But this is where you can see we start to begin to talk about our density factor. We're not regulating from units per acre per standpoint. It's a units per given amount of square footage in a building. So this is very focused on the architecture of a building in terms of how massing is laid out. And obviously, it still kind of does boil down to units per acre because there are lot dimensions and there are setbacks. You can only put so much massing on a building. You can kind of start with the box on the lot and figure out density through the density factor from there. Here's a couple more. Our shop house, a mixed-use building by nature, commercial, retail on the first floor with apartments, offices above. This code is far more use agnostic than our current code. We ended up collapsing our over 250 individual uses into specific use categories that allows for a broader interpretation. So no more going to the zoning board for a use variance when your use isn't in the code. It allows us to kind of put it into consumer goods or something that's very broad, but as long as it fits and operates in the building, it's an appropriate use. We also then get into massing and architectural components. So you have your main massing, but you want to do a side wing or a rear wing. We have standards for that so that those additions are not out of proportion with the main massing. But then architectural components like balconies or stoops or porticos, porticoches, these are all ways of ensuring that those elements are designed and built well and are recognizable. And they also have, they provide amenity space, other things that are in the code that there's multiple ways of meeting specific requirements through these different components and using the standards associated with them. So I'll end just with a little timeline slide to kind of show exactly what we've gone through. So again, back in October of 21, the master plan gets adopted. I joined the city in August of 22. We issued the RFP in December of that year. We selected Principal Group, who they're based out of Boston. In April, we pressed pause while we went after a HOP grant. My firstborn son was born in October to just throw a nice little lovely wrench into this process, but he's been fantastic. And we went through some visioning. We have done a whole lot of public engagement through this process. And I won't read all of these bullet points, but you can see that it has just been quite the effort. We've done I think now we're over 20 public presentations with over 16 full days of public engagement and just continued meetings with developers, design professionals, and anyone who has a question, they're welcome to reach out. We have phone calls, meetings, email correspondences with people daily, and it's been a really fantastic project, and we're very hopeful to submit for legislation in the coming weeks. So we might. I'm expecting that we will be adopted and effective by September, maybe a little earlier if we are fortunate. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. That was really very, very informative. Next, going to turn it over to Joseph Perez from the Town of Plymouth.
Great. Thank you so much, Noah, and thank you, Sam. That's a really exciting project, and I look forward to seeing that continue to move forward. Uh, and I hope everybody here is having a good conference so far. For those who don't know, my name is Joseph Perez. I'm the Director of Planning and Economic Development for the Town of Plymouth. And for those who don't know Plymouth, we're located in between the lakes region and the mountains. It's a town of about 6,600 people, home to Plymouth State University. Development patterns are somewhat traditional for a smaller town in our state. We have a very vibrant village centered around the university, centered around a town common. We've also got a major commercial corridor, Tenny Mountain Highway. We have a ski area that's been seeing some more uh, exciting things happening there lately, Tenny Mountain. So a lot of interesting things happening, but kind of a conventional village development pattern. I'll start by going back a little bit because this is a little different from the project that Sam talked about at Nashua. Plymouth is a select board, town manager, town meeting form of government, and just a much smaller town. So the approach to a similar type of project was a little bit different. So going back to about 2022, Plymouth, like many other communities, was in the midst of a community conversation about housing affordability, the costs of housing with respect to income. And I think this was in no way unique to Plymouth, but it was really intensified right around that 2022 time. And that time, interestingly enough, shows up in this graph of the affordability index. So I think it's clear why this has become such a hot button issue statewide. And Plymouth has some historical planning with respect to housing, but not anything that was primed to deal with the housing situation that existed in 2022. So back in 2018, Plymouth had rewritten its master plan, and in 2003, the town had undertaken a housing study, but that housing study from 2003 was really not equipped, of course, to deal with the situation that existed in 2022. It's interesting to note that that study identified that throughout the 90s, growth was able to be accommodated in Plymouth and in the surrounding region without really adding much new housing stock because just existing vacant units were being brought online and there wasn't a strain at that point. But it did project that that would change and it certainly did. And then in 2018, our master plan had paid some attention to housing. But the time was right to revisit the issue, and that just so happened to be the time that the Invest NH Planning and Zoning Grant Program, the HOP grant program, was being rolled out. So Plymouth was able to, and fortunate to receive a grant for a three-phase HOP project: needs assessment, regulatory audit, and regulatory development. And the town was very fortunate to work with Barrett Planning Group and Judi Barrett on all three phases of this project and really just update our planning and visioning documents starting in phase one because again 2018 2003 it was time to really assess where we were, and also we knew that our regulations hadn't been looked at in depth in quite some time. Plymouth adopted zoning in 1961. It's been tweaked around the edges almost every year at town meeting since then. So that's a lot of very incremental or some years bigger changes, but not very much in the way of wholesale rewrites. So the needs assessment was our first step, obviously, and it was an opportunity for the town to really gain an understanding of uh, what the needs were with respect to housing and also where we were. So who wasn't being served by the current housing market, what people's concerns were. And this was really where most of our community outreach was focused as well, starting in this needs assessment to just understand where people were with respect to the issue of housing. What did the community value? What was important to people? And what did people want to see more of? And then the zoning audit which was part two, came shortly after that, and in some ways was integrated. And there were a lot of interesting recommendations that came out of that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And I think, in some communities, maybe in a bigger community, this probably was enough of a list to say maybe we should start over. But in Plymouth, the approach was different. The approach ended up being, let's make as many tweaks here and there as we can to make things work better, to make sure that our regulations are serving the community by allowing what people want and ensuring that they are aligned with the values and needs of the community, and not serving as a barrier. But there also was a lot of interest in maintaining the core structure of the zoning ordinance. Our districts, generally speaking, were liked, and there was not necessarily an appetite to change district boundaries or sort of the general themes of our zoning ordinance. So, we were able to complete those projects. Those resulted in some phase one and phase two reports, and they were both informed by a whole host of different community engagement initiatives. That includes many, many community meetings, a survey, lots of sticky dot exercises. And we also had an opportunity to look at some of our existing lots, similar to what Sam was describing in Nashua. We identified that a large number of lots were out of conformity. And part of this engagement was actually trying to understand what those lots looked like. So we were able to do some walking tours with the planning board and the public to really look at some of these lots and understand, when you're standing next to a 10,000 square foot lot, what does it look like? And we were able to do that by mapping out our densities beforehand and just charting a walk through a lot of these historic neighborhoods in and around our village that were largely non-conforming. Themes that we heard a lot about in the engagement and in the analysis: accessory dwelling units, big support for enabling folks to build an accessory dwelling unit. It was seen as something that was a natural extension of what someone ought to be able to do with their home, whether it's a attached or a detached unit. Generally, lots of interest in that and lots of support for making that an easy thing for folks to do. Parking standards, those were seen as very confusing. We had a lot of fractional parking requirements. We had a lot of requirements that just didn't really make a lot of sense. Single family attached was a housing type we heard a lot about. So townhouse style condominiums, great for either starter homes or folks who are looking to downsize, and identified as something that generally was not seen very much in our community. There are a few developments, but not as many as a lot of our community members would like to see, especially as they, again, either think about downsizing or think about what it would mean to have starter home options for folks, for young families. And then an interesting one, residential co-location, or also you might think of this as a cottage court. When you go back to the sticky dot exercises or to a lot of our focus group conversations, there was a surprising amount of support for this style of development. And I don't think I would have anticipated that. Uh, but that's part of what's important about this being a community-led effort, and not, that the people in the community felt a sense of ownership, and that they had the opportunity to weigh in right from the very beginning about what they wanted to see. And this was one of the things that really came out of those discussions. And, we'll talk more about how that uh, played out a little bit later in this slideshow. But again, another one that was a bit of a surprise. And then open space residential development was a type of development that was provided for already in zoning, but our standards were out of date. They hadn't been revisited in a while, and it was clear that that needed to be modernized. And then zoning district right sizing. Looking through those zoning districts, it became quickly apparent that 40% of the lots in the single family residential zone and 85% of lots in the multifamily residential zone do not meet the minimum lot size. And then you can expect a similar phenomenon with road frontage requirements, setbacks, etc. And then, another aspect of right sizing was looking at what uses were permitted in some of these existing districts. It was interesting to contemplate that in our multifamily residential district, multifamily dwellings were not a by right use, which was quickly identified as something that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. So then, we continued to look through, um, some of our other items, and in doing so, we also looked backwards, which I think was very helpful as just an exercise, understanding how we got from where we were to where we are with respect to our zoning ordinance. And interestingly, if you go back to 1985, our zoning ordinance actually did have an allowance for a 10,000 square foot minimum lot size in our single family district and a 12,000 square foot minimum lot size in our multifamily district. That's about a quarter of an acre. And then somewhere between then and 2022, that had increased to the point where it was a half acre minimum lot size in both of those districts. And that was something that I think a lot of folks hadn't realized had that back in 1985 you could have a house, you could do a subdivision with quarter acre lots in these districts, and you couldn't anymore. And especially as we talked about starter homes or more inexpensive ways for folks to obtain a house, that became something that folks really were interested in going back to. And then another area that came out of this, another theme, was the master plan growth areas. So our master plan in 2018 had identified a couple of growth areas that were suitable for high intensity development. And generally, those were still areas that emerged when we were talking with community members about where they would like to see higher levels of development. The most the most significant of those are the areas around the Tenny Mountain Ski Area in West Plymouth and the area along the eastern end of Fairgrounds Road in North Plymouth. So those were areas that we felt that there could be some benefit to maybe making zoning changes or to adopting some kind of overlay district to incentivize more development. But all these themes that came out of this analysis and out of this community engagement weren't things that we necessarily would have been able to do all at once. But what we were able to do was try to distill them into 7 distinct zoning amendments that really were targeted at cleaning up the zoning ordinance and making tweaks to existing sections, existing language to make these items, these themes, more workable. So updating definitions, how we define uses, whether uses are permitted by right or by special exception in the use table, revising our dimensional requirements, revising the parking requirements, uh, just rewriting the language about how the zoning ordinance deals with multiple buildings on a single lot, uh, rewriting the open space residential development section, and then just tweaking some areas with respect to accessory dwelling units. Those 7 amendments were put forward and all approved by town meeting by a pretty large margin. And it's interesting, you'll note that what's not included in this is the master plan growth areas. The planning board had some intensive conversations and community engagement and decided that it was not timely to put those forward yet. Those needed a little more review, a little more discussion and consideration, but the board really felt that it was important to do these changes in 2024. So this would have been the March 2024 town meeting. And then it's always a question when you adopt something like this, some tweaks to a zoning ordinance, will they actually get used? You hope they do, of course, because they should be making the, reducing barriers to what people want to see, but you never know. And I think we were interested to see that they actually were used, but maybe not the aspects of them that we thought would be used. So very shortly after adoption, or relatively shortly after adoption, the town saw its first couple of applications for new residential developments in quite some time, and both of them made use of the residential co-location, or the ability to place multiple single or two-family lot dwellings on a lot by conditional use permit. And this is an example from Texas Hill Road, just a little bit outside of town, where a developer built actually two of these side by side. So a total of 8 units and 4 duplexes, rental units. And then we saw shortly after that a slightly different application of it, where a developer built an 11-unit project, 5 duplexes and a single family, accessed by a shared driveway on one lot. And these were intended as ownership units, so a little bit different. But I do think it's interesting that, when you adopt zoning changes like that, I do think that it was a surprise to us that what immediately resulted in the most new development was the multiple single or two-family dwellings on a lot by special exception. I know that wouldn't have been my guess, but that I think speaks to the advantage of making a lot of little tweaks here and there based on these themes that we heard, because sometimes you can't necessarily anticipate what will be the most useful. And then we're continuing to receive applications or hear conceptual consultations that use some of these tweaks. So this is a new application we've received recently, where someone would, again, use residential co-location to place 2 additional single-family units on a lot that has an existing 2-family. This is more of an infill context. And then this development would also utilize the reduced front setback requirements, which previously the 30-foot front setback would have made this totally not feasible without a variance, but with that ability to reduce the front setback and this residential co-location provision, they've been able to propose this infill development. I've also seen conceptual consultations for some subdivisions which would use reduced lot size requirements, though certainly we haven't seen any subdivisions that use that on a very large scale, but still an interesting thing. And then over the course of those about 2 years since those were adopted, the planning board has continued to think about master plan growth areas. That was the big theme that was not acted upon at that time. But the board didn't give up. The board kept thinking about them, trying to get input, have community conversations about them, and make tweaks to make sure that they could get an amendment that was just right, so to speak. And then fast forward to March of this year, 2026, the board did put forward 2 zoning amendments to town meeting. And those are Tenny Mountain Overlay District and Fairgrounds Road Residential Overlay District. So opening up more opportunities for different types of development in these areas identified by the master plan. But again, this approach that the board has taken has been incremental, and just adding an overlay district was seen as much more acceptable, much more feasible than actually rewriting our district boundaries. But adopting an overlay, you're able to allow people to maintain their existing zoning rights. So whatever you can do in the underlying district, you can continue to do, but you now have another option. And so the Fairgrounds Road Residential Overlay District focuses on enabling middle housing types, middle density on smaller lots in an area of town that has water and sewer service, that is relatively flat, and that also has some existing residential development, and was widely seen in community engagement as a very suitable place for middle density, missing middle housing types, small single family attached, duplexes, small lot single family, that sort of thing. So that's one. And then the second one is the Tenny Mountain Overlay District in West Plymouth, which is somewhat centered around the Tenny Mountain ski area, but the district is much larger than just that area. The intention of that district was to follow up on the master plan recommendation to enable more high intensity mixed use development around the ski area and its environs. So enabling planned unit development in that area, which is a new thing for Plymouth. But by keeping it in this area, I think folks were very willing to allow that as an option. But it is a pretty significant change, though ultimately, again, not really revising too much of the zoning ordinance, just adding this on top as an option for a portion of the zoning ordinance. And then we also, at that time, the planning board put forward some further accessory dwelling unit changes. And along with these two overlay districts, the board put some zoning amendments on the ballot, and they were all adopted again by a pretty large margin. And I think part of that is due to the support that the board was able to develop over the 2 years between the first tranche of changes and the second set of changes. The board was monitoring those changes, making sure everything was going well, and it seemed to be. And the board also gave the public confidence that they were not rushing into any big changes. I think that was important for people to see. So again, when the time came to put forward another set of tweaks, they were again very widely supported by the residents of the town. And both of those districts have now been adopted. We haven't seen either of them utilized yet, but I'm sure we may in the future. And I think it's really interesting to see how it's over the course of 9 or 10 different zoning amendments, making tweaks here and there. We've really been able to make some significant headway into hopefully making the zoning ordinance work better for folks and better align with the values that people want to see and the types of housing that people want to see in Plymouth. So we're trying to continue that work as well. It's not over. We're going to be working as a result of the HOP grant. We've been able to bring Plan New Hampshire in, and they'll be helping us look more in our village, a portion of our village center with a community design charrette similar to Nashua's. I think that's a really exciting thing. And we've also been able to, under HOP grant round 2, work with Barrett Planning yet again on a housing master plan chapter for the Plymouth master plan. And so I think we're trying to keep the momentum going, keep things moving, but I think just illustrating a very different approach to making some fairly significant or widespread changes to the zoning ordinance, but in a very different way and in a very different context. So I think that's a large part of why we were able to have some success, but not by holistically rewriting our zoning ordinance, but by chipping away here and there and just trying to make it better where we can, and with the goal of having something that serves the community much better than the old document. So that's all I have. I will turn it now over to Judi, I believe.
I do think it's my turn.
Yep, that was. Thank you so much, Joseph. Yeah, we're going to turn it over to Judi Barrett now.
Thank you. So, Noah, I'm not seeing my slides.
You should have a take control button.
I did.
You did take control, and it's not advancing? Sir. Is it advancing or no?
I know I'm not doing anything.
Okay, hold on.
Here's to just not like me. Take back. Let me see. There we go. Yay. Thank you so much. So, hi, everyone. I'm Judi Barrett. I'm happy to be part of this conference again. I always enjoy New Hampshire planning conferences, and I love working in New Hampshire, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our experiences there and in some other communities as well around ways to think about how to tackle zoning reform, because it's not always easy. And I think as both of the examples you just saw, it can take quite a while, which is good. And sometimes an incremental approach works well, as it did in Plymouth's case, and other times, you really need to sort of go full speed ahead. And we're actually working in 2 communities right now in New Hampshire on that type of zoning. So let me see. Here we go. So I always think it's helpful to start out thinking about just some important questions to ask. Like, first of all, like, why are you doing this? Has there been some great awakening in your community, perhaps as a result of some master planning effort? Kind of like I think what really happened in Nashua, and that great awakening can really lead to sort of an epiphany about sort of across the board change. Is there an effort underway in your community among residents to sort of promote housing or stop housing, and there's a push-pull there? And how does that sort of shape what your approach might be to zoning reform? And I'm going to speak specifically here, I think, in the context of zoning reform for housing, but I don't think this is limited to housing, not in my experience. I've been in this business now 38 years, and I feel like I've probably seen it all. Are there developers talking to your planning board, your staff, about some ideas they have to change zoning on property they own because they like to be able to do something different, or they have a vision for the site that's just not aligned with your zoning? Are you in litigation, perhaps, because of matters in your zoning that simply may be a legal problem? Is there a desire for tax-based growth? Is there a desire for no growth? Are there special market considerations going on, like short-term rentals? And I think when you kind of go through these questions, it can help you figure out what is going to be the mode of attack. I also think it's really thinking about how much are you trying to change. For some communities, and I think fondly of Plymouth's situation with this, there were probably a lot of things that could be better, but sometimes you need to start with the simple fixes to build trust with the community. Are you trying to create a whole new district, which, as you saw in Plymouth's case, is actually what was happening with a couple of those overlays? Are you eliminating a useless district? We work all the time in communities that have districts that aren't working at all. And it may be that the regulations for the district need to be reformed. It may be that the district itself just doesn't make sense. And are you trying to change policy, structure, or format, or both? And I think the answers to that question are really critical, because if you're trying to fix structure, it's hard to do that in tweaks. You're actually looking at a more global effort at zoning reform. And when I think about this, for me, it's often there's really sort of a soup to nuts repair that needs to happen. It's both the structure and really the content itself. And actually, 2 of the projects we're working on in New Hampshire right now, Berlin and Conway, very different communities, but in both cases, it's really kind of a soup to nuts rewrite. Another thing to think about is who's actually driving the bus on this. So there's this perfect alignment I love to see in communities, and I can wish, I guess, and sometimes it happens, where the planning board and the staff and other boards and commissions are kind of all on the same page. There's organized constituents that are on the same page with local officials. There are community groups that are kind of rowing in the same direction with city or town hall, and developers who are actually at the table and working closely with the community. And everybody's kind of trying to get to the same place, even if they have somewhat different ideas about how to get there. But the bus is fundamentally being driven by people who are in alignment. And when you have that, it's magic, and take advantage of it, because it's often not the case. Because the other option is that it's the perfect storm, and that people don't understand like why town officials or city officials would be trying to fundamentally change the zoning. And sometimes the fundamentally change isn't really seeking to change established patterns. It's actually to make sure that they're legal, that you can do them again. That's certainly the case in Plymouth, and I think in Nashua as well. It's like, how do you sort of celebrate these neighborhoods that you have that you've made illegal through years of zoning changes? So sometimes people don't understand that that's really what's going on, and the whole thing can kind of feel like a hot potato. So there are some benefits to incremental change. I think baby steps can be better than no change. I can certainly say in Plymouth, I often think about lots of other things I'd love to see the town do, and I'm sure they're thinking the same thing. But sometimes you kind of have to start slowly because there's trust that needs to be built up with the community. Sometimes there's conflicts on town boards that need to get, resolved. So I think that the sort of incremental change approach makes sense in communities that don't have a significant track record with zoning reform. If there are controversies or disagreements within the planning board or other municipal boards, maybe kind of stepping back to things that people can agree on. Communities with limited staff capacity need to think seriously about just how much can we take on in this community today and be successful with it. Because the last thing you want to do is embark on some very ambitious agenda and then just not be able to deliver on it because the capacity isn't there. And then thinking about, are there changes we want to make that may ruffle some feathers, but not enough to sort of trigger a world war? Are there things that we can do that might make things a little bit better and that people won't flip out about? Plymouth again kind of comes to mind as a place that sort of took that approach. It was necessary, and it was necessary for a variety of reasons. One, I think people were just not accustomed to seeing zoning changes come forward. I don't think the board itself was really in agreement about how to move forward. So you take the things that you can do when your zoning is just such a mess. You need to be able to make, some headway. So I would just say, if you're one of those communities that's in that incremental mode, don't be shamed by it because you can get good things to happen by taking things a little bit more slowly or steadily. I think too, communities need to think about, will we be more successful in the long run if we break big zoning changes into smaller bites? It can be done. It can also raise some issues for you and making sure that you don't end up creating inconsistencies somewhere else in your zoning ordinance because you're trying to make one or two kind of specific tweaks and not looking at the rest of the ordinance holistically and seeing where a change might actually create a new problem. I worked once with a town in Massachusetts several years ago that had hired another consultant, an excellent zoning consultant, to work with them just to reform their industrial district regulations. And he did a great job on a lot of it, but didn't see that one of the things he was working on was going to create a conflict with another section of the ordinance or bylaw in Massachusetts, as it's called. And so for a whole year, when developers were trying to build in this particular industrial zone, they had to go to the Board of Appeals for a variance because of this conflict that was created, because this really wonderful zoning consultant I know well just didn't see a conflict somewhere else in the ordinance. So I would just say, even when you're making tweaks, you really need to make sure you've kind of done an ordinance-wide look so that you don't end up creating those kind of inconsistencies unwittingly. Rolling back changes in Plymouth, and Joseph, I'm picking on Plymouth because you already spoke about Plymouth, so I can talk about it specifically, but rolling back changes that had created widespread nonconformity. I remember well a map that we had at a meeting where it just showed like red all over the town of these lots that had been made nonconforming simply because over time people started to have a negative view of housing growth, and so they tried to stop it. And what they did is they adopted zoning dimensional regulations that were completely contrary to the lovelier forms that were on the ground, really had happened sort of organically over time. I think two changes that were a little bit less scary to people in that community made a lot of sense. I'm working with another community right now in Massachusetts where it's the same situation, that people are a little bit hesitant about major change, but when you break it down for them, they can kind of see the benefits of a very specific change that you're trying to make and how it could benefit a particular area of town. Introducing new ideas incrementally. When we talk about character districts in some communities, they have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. But certainly in that, Nashua example, you can see, what character districts really are just terribly important. And you're looking more at the architecture and the form of development and introducing big ideas, perhaps as a second or third phase. I don't know how many of you can see this. You don't have to read the whole thing, but this is one of my favorite things. I do a lot of zoning fixes. It sort of seems to become my lot in life as a zoning consultant. We get called often to help communities just fix a mess, even before they try to take on sort of major policy changes. And one of the things that I often look for are just big, long paragraphs that have lots of ideas crammed into them. And there's just so much broken up by commas or semicolons that you can't make sense out of what's being said. So I recently worked on one where there was a sentence with 221 words in it or something, just strung together by a series of clauses. I felt like I was, back in a college English class reading Henry James or something. It was just really frightening. So when you have things like this, even if you're not trying to make major changes elsewhere in your ordinance, you can fix this pretty easily just by breaking it up and being able to show people in a bullet list or a numbered list. These are things that apply to this particular use. You need to be able to do this, X, Y, and Z, and then this, X, Y, and Z. And that's just a much easier thing for somebody to get than reading a gigantic paragraph with just a blur of text thrown together. Another thing I look for often is how zoning ordinances and so forth define the term family. I would say all of you should be looking at this. If you don't already have a definition of family that's inclusive, you probably should be thinking about it. The typical, I think, kind of exclusionary definition refers to households that are joined by blood, marriage, or adoption, and then controls the number of unrelated people living together. But I think a more fair housing conscious definition is simply to recognize that a family can be one or more people occupying a dwelling unit together. So I always encourage communities to look at how they define family and make sure that's actually working for them, and also not creating a situation where housing that's occupied by multiple unrelated adults, such as group homes, becomes difficult to do. This is another thing that I just find so sad when I work on zoning. So some communities I've worked in have both use regulations in text as well as in a table. And you might think that's helpful, but let me tell you it's not. Because what we find over and over again is that what the text regulations say for the uses in a particular district are often out of alignment with what's in the table of uses. So it falls to an applicant and a building commissioner to figure out, or building inspector to figure out what all this means. And this is just an example from a zoning audit we did for a community about a year ago, where we really this wasn't even all the examples, it was just the obvious ones that we were able to put into a table where the text regulations for the district said one thing and then the table said something different. And how do you then resolve this? This is the sort of thing that, frankly, can be fixed in tweaks, but is often just better addressed with a more holistic look at a zoning ordinance. But these problems are common, and you may not even realize it. If there's a use that hasn't been triggered by an application for 5 years, you may not even realize that these disconnects exist. But trust me, if you're trying to regulate uses both in text and in table, you probably have some of these disconnects. The other thing that I find frustrating as a consultant is the repeated reliance on the term community character. We often find that people usually I would say, cannot really break down what that means. And it's even more troubling when you have a zoning ordinance that doesn't define even the basic purposes of a district. So if you just have a list of districts in your establishment of district section and it doesn't really say anything about what their purposes are, that's something you might want to think about. I will just simply point out, however, that when you tackle that task, it can open up a whole Pandora's box. So just be prepared for perhaps having to confront what really should be confronted, which is what do we actually mean in this ordinance when we talk about character in different districts. And it often has nothing to do with use and everything to do with form and dimensions, and scale and massing and so forth. So this is the problem that I'm facing now in two communities we're working with in New Hampshire, which is when you have a fundamentally disorganized ordinance and you can't even get to zoning reform because you have so many disconnects. And one of the ones that we're working on right now, there's a table of uses, and it doesn't really agree with the text. But in addition, the ordinance has a section for each district. And ostensibly, it's an old style pyramid where you start with the most restrictive district and move forward. But the structure of each district section is out of alignment. They don't follow the same pattern. The other thing that happens is that there's tremendous duplication. So we started pulling this ordinance apart, and we were able to take, I think it was 36 pages of sign regulations, and simply create a new sign section that brought it down to 9 pages. So think about, what are you putting people through just trying to find content in your zoning ordinance, where simply a reorganization could make things so much better. And I think in one case in particular we're working on, we have to go through that reorganization process sort of as a first move, and then take on the more policy level implementation of the master plan the community recently did, which is a beautiful master plan. And we're fortunate to have their master plan consultants on our team as subcontractors. But you can't even get to the implementation of that master plan without fixing the structure of that ordinance first. It's just too critical to do. And being able to sort of take to the community an ordinance that doesn't make a whole lot of changes in content, but at least is something everybody can read. In that community, they feel as though that is a sort of critical step for building kind of trust with residents. So, odd or difficult definitions to understand. This one, I still struggle with this. A definition of a buffer or corridor zone: a protective buffer strip naturally vegetated or planted with native or indigenous saplings, shrubs, and ground covers, displaying a typical woodland appearance appropriated to the conditions and said type of the landforms. No one really knows what that means, but there it is in the ordinance. So cleaning up definitions is a very important part of cleaning up a zoning ordinance. You need to really look at what your definitions say, and you might understand why people struggle sometimes. Pervasive nonconformity, a la Plymouth. When you've made so many zoning changes over 30 years that have essentially made entire neighborhoods nonconforming, I think it can be really helpful to have, in a sort of community setting, like a community mapping exercise, to be able to just sort of roll out on a table without the zoning district lines there. Here's this neighborhood. Here's what's on the ground. So be able to sort of work with an orthophoto. And what do you think belongs here? And kind of rolling back to that level of, what do you think really is appropriate in this neighborhood? And how would you sort of define what this is in boundary? Where would you put it? You often learn a lot just from having people think about, here's this area, here's what's in it. What would you add here? Where would you add it? And how is this different for perhaps a place that's not too far down the road, but developed at a sort of different point in time, and is really kind of speaking to a different market? That kind of planning process can be so important, not only for a master plan, but really the zoning reform process itself. I think a soup to nuts rewrite, as I call it, is required when tweaks just simply aren't going to be enough. When you have an ordinance that has to be reorganized, which is the case in 2 of the communities I'm working on right now, and there are multiple structural defects like inconsistencies, repetition, and so forth. When you have a zoning ordinance that's kind of that pervasively messed up, it's really important to step back and say, we got to fix this. And, if you can not only fix it and introduce some fundamental policy changes, I think that's great. But if you can't get all the way to all the policy changes you want to make, don't be daunted by the possibility of at least fixing what you have so someone can make sense out of it. So I think about this as kind of a continuum of fixes in zoning. And, one is sort of, by the way, if you don't know who that is, it's Euclid. But, if you could be helpful just adding graphics and design guidelines to a Euclidean sort of use-based ordinance. Don't let anybody tell you that that's failure, because it's not. If anything you can do to make it better and more readable for people is a good thing to do. Manageable, to me, fix is introducing perhaps form-based code or character districts as optional overlays. It's not the best solution, but it's a solution that might incrementally get you closer to where you really want to be. Taking the next step is yet another sort of step on that continuum of perhaps weaving a form-based code into an existing structure, like parallel fixes. And then when form replaces use, which is really a city or town-wide form-based code effort, is really sort of, I think, the pinnacle in this field, at least at this point in time. But I would just say, for those of you that are in smaller communities or where zoning reform is really an uphill battle, form-based code is not the only option for major zoning revisions and soup to nut updates. It's a great tool. It's a great approach. I get it. I applaud communities that do it. But I think a lot can still be done within a Euclidean framework and still get you somewhere far better than you are now. So you really have to take the temperature of your community, the capacity of the board and staff, and then plan your strategy accordingly. And it may be that you hit all four of these at some point in your effort to, to remove regulatory barriers in your zoning to support housing and other growth. I often think of the Tenny Mountain situation in Plymouth as not so much about housing, but rather building a tax base in a community that really struggles with its tax base. There's just a lot of nonprofit land there, and they have difficulty. So that particular tool could bring some housing, but I think it also is going to bring badly needed investment into that town. No matter what approach you take, I would just say, be brave, because it is a lot of work and it's a lot of fun work. And when you have a victory, as has happened in Plymouth over the last couple of years, it can just be a very gratifying thing to do. So that's my thought. Somebody going to take control back of this now, Noah?
Yep. Well, thank you so much, Judi and Sam and Joseph. We now have about 10 minutes for questions before our lunch break. I see a question from Jennifer. Can you combine zoning, site plan, and subdivision regulations into one unified bylaw or ordinance? And what's your opinion on doing that?
So I want to jump in on this one a little bit because we did some of that in Plymouth. The open space residential development changes were actually not made in zoning. The whole, almost all of it was done through subdivision because it was just the more elegant way to do it. So I think you really have to look at all of them. We didn't get as far as site plan. We're actually confronting that right now in another town we're working in. But sometimes you really have to look at all three because if they don't align, you can change zoning and still have a subdivision ordinance that doesn't really deliver for you what you want it to do. And I think just anything you can do to allow fee simple homeownership through lotting and subdivision changes is just very important.
Great. And I think Sam also wanted to take a stab at that question.
Yeah, I'll just kind of double on that. We are doing that right now in Nashua. And I think as Judi identified, it really is a matter of making sure that everything functions together and you don't want any conflicts with between zoning and site plan subdivision. You don't want parking regulations to appear in both, something like that. But we're finding that by updating the zoning and by transitioning to a form-based, there were such fundamental shifts that we needed to do site plan and subdivision at the same time. And so we will have a unified land use code at the end of this, but it is an effort, and that is the only caveat I'll say.
Yeah, and I would just note that if you're in a town meeting town like Plymouth, it is important with respect to the question about specifically combining them into one document. Town meeting has to approve any changes to the zoning ordinance, whereas the planning board can, upon a public hearing, change site plan and subdivision regulations. So think about that if you were thinking about combining them. I mean, definitely echo everything Judi and Sam said about making sure they're harmonized. There aren't contradictions, but especially with zoning being in the mix, I think having just making sure that the community is ready to understand that it means you would need to potentially have town meeting approve any changes depending on how you structure something like that. If you had to change your zoning in order to also change a piece of your subdivision or site plan review regulations. And then, you don't want to have a lag between that.
Great, thanks. Thanks, I think those are great points. Um, we have a request from Lori to talk more about design guidelines. Anybody want to talk about how they've incorporated design architectural guidelines into their
Sure.
code rewrites?
I'll take a stab at that. And I think it's important to note that like you can have a form-based code, but you can also have design guidelines for, say, like performance districts. You know, it doesn't have to be a blanket approach. But I think that the form-based aspect has been a really useful selling point. I had mentioned it in my presentation, but by you're almost kind of front running the objection of like, you know, we don't want this code to destroy our community character. It's like, well, actually, you know, we went out, we surveyed, we were literally measuring windows on buildings to get a sense of like, what are the existing patterns and how can we replicate that from a regulatory standpoint? And then we report that back and people are like, oh, wow, like you did the work, you did the surveys, and it has really paid dividends for us in terms of the buy-in for this code.
Great. Thank you. Judi or Joseph, do you have anything to add on design guidelines? Are you good?
No, I just wanted to say what Sam just talked about is exactly what the city of Somerville, Massachusetts did. They were literally measuring porch widths. I mean, and the effort they put into trying to show that they were really trying to document the character of the different neighborhoods in that city made such a big deal. It was such a difference.
I just want to say, full disclosure, our code consultant is the same consultant that did Somerville's code.
Yes, I wasn't going to say that, but anyways, they did.
Another question from Stephanie, which Judi, I think you kind of already responded to. I may have missed this, but have your community zoning ordinance reviewed from an outside person? What would be a good place to start other than through the local planning commission?
So we were able to fortunately use HOP grant funding to have Barrett Planning and Judi come in and do a regulatory audit of our zoning ordinance. And that was really valuable for a lot of reasons. In large part because, you know, our community, as Judi acknowledged in her presentation, there were some questions about, you know, differing opinions amongst people on different boards and committees, a lot of different views within the community about what to do. And I think being able to talk to a community about having a neutral sort of outside person, just that framing of the conversation, let's have someone else come in and tell, not one of, you know, not someone who's already seen as entrenched or already seen as, you know, on one side or another of any particular issue from the past or previous discussions, but just let's get a fresh perspective, and having Barrett Planning able to offer that was really valuable. And I don't think we would have seen any in any to any extent the level of community buy-in, community trust that was built up between the housing committee and the planning board and the public without having you know, Barrett Planning or the HOP grant to fund that program.
And Stephanie, I might just add on that as well, that, you know what, once your community feels like it's kind of built up enough of a fund balance for such a project, that's obviously going to vary from community to community. It could take a couple years, kind of in a couple of cycles of the budget. Then, you know, kind of it's relatively common for communities to put these projects out to RFP. And so that can be a great way to kind of make sure you're getting attracting consultants other than just your local planning commission, firms like Judi's and others.
Yeah, I just want to add to, the state of New Hampshire deserves so much credit for those HOP grants. You don't often find that in other states. I just want to be really clear. I think those grants were just critical for a lot of communities to be able to step back and look at their zoning and come out of it with fixes that, obviously were intended mainly to benefit housing. But but other things came out of it in terms of zoning reform that were just very important. So any of the communities that use that, I don't care who you worked with, I hope everybody feels like they benefited from that program, because it was really magnificent to see, as a consultant, a state really putting that much effort into helping communities improve their zoning.
Great. I'm not have time for any last questions folks want to put in the chat. We are pushing up against our lunch break, but I'll give one more opportunity if anybody has any last burning questions. Great. I am not seeing any, so I want to thank all three of our speakers for this great session: Sam Durfee, Joseph Perez, and Judi Barrett. I certainly learned a lot. We are going to take a 1 hour break for lunch, and we'll resume at 12:45 for our afternoon sessions. Our first session after lunch is Building Code 101 for planners. And then our final session after lunch will be Historic Preservation Planning Tools for your community. So we'll see everybody back here, hopefully in about an hour. Thank you.